Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. We're going to go ahead and just give it another minute to let people hop on, and then we'll go ahead and get started. All right. I still see people joining, but I think we should go ahead and get started because we have a lot of content to cover today. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for the second webinar of our Financial Foundation series focused on budgeting essentials. My name is Emily Platt, and I'm the Vice President of Advisor Success here at Wealthspire Advisors. I'll be moderating today's session and will also help guide us through Q&A at the end. I know we have both clients and non-clients joining us today, so I want to give just a quick introduction to Wealthspire. We are an independent fiduciary wealth management firm with over 20 offices nationwide, managing more than 30 billion in assets. We work primarily with high and ultra high net worth individuals and families, offering personalized planning, investment management, and guidance across generations. I know I said this on the last call, but it definitely remains true that at our core, we're a learning organization. We really are committed not just to managing wealth, but to empowering our clients through education and meaningful long-term relationships. And that's why we created the Financial Foundation Summer Series. It really is to provide clear, actionable education on essential financial concepts. Just a few administrative items I want to jump into. The Q&A box is open, so feel free to drop in questions at any time during the presentation. I'll be monitoring that, and we'll address those during the Q&A portion at the end of the session. And today's session is also being recorded. So we'll be sending the recording, slides, and registration links for the rest of the series in the follow-up email to everyone who registered. If you would also like a copy of the recording and slides from the first session, Investment 101, definitely reach out and let us know. Our next session will be Investment 201 on July 29th, diving deeper into investment vehicles, portfolio management, behavioral economics, and then that session will be followed by a conversation around family wealth conversations on August 19th. With that, we're excited to be joined today for Budgeting Essentials by two of our wealth advisors, Julie Penwell, based in Seattle, and Ryan Moore, based in San Francisco. They really do have a passion for helping individuals feel more confident and in control of their finances, whether that's through budgeting, building healthy money habits, or simply just getting started. They really are the best people for this session today. Julie also has a fantastic Instagram page that I want to highlight. She breaks down financial concepts and makes them incredibly easy to understand. And we'll include a link in the follow-up if you'd like to check it out. I highly recommend looking at it. I think with that, I'll turn it over to the team to get started. I know high level, they really want to just go deeper into understanding the basic concepts of what is budgeting, what is cash flow, what is net worth management. They are going to stay really high level, but feel free to ask questions. And this is for you. So we want to make sure that it is as helpful as possible when it comes to budgeting, whether you're getting started or you're well into your career or retirement and just want a refresher on some of the key concepts here. So with that, I think I'll pass it on to Ryan to take it from here.
Yeah, starting off, just give you a little highlight of what we'll be discussing: the importance of budgeting and cash flow management, high level, the making of a budget and budget resources, some things that we have found that has been useful for people of all stages of life. And then we'll start digging down a little bit deeper into a little bit more actionable steps, savings and investments. Where do these funds actually go, during which time frame, and keeping it actionable going forward. And then, like they said, we have some key takeaways and some Q&A at the end.
Awesome. Thanks, Ryan. So to go ahead and get started, we'll just dive right into really what is a budget. So we define a budget as a system tracking dollars coming in, so income and expenses, so dollars going out, to help you make more informed financial decisions and understand your progress towards both your near and long-term goals. So Ryan, if that's what a budget is, can you maybe talk a little bit about why it's important to have a budget?
Yeah, a budget is a powerful tool on a path to financial freedom and independence. And that may seem counterintuitive, especially the freedom part. I know a lot of us have some preconceptions about budgets and they may be constraints, but they're really designed to give us autonomy and insight into our actual spending. Budgets are not a punishment if we haven't been looking at our expenses. They're useful for people at all stages of life. We can always optimize, we can always increase our situation, even if our life is just gradually improving, or very helpful if we're having some large life transitions.
Yeah. So I think that's a helpful context of why it's important to budget. I also think it's always fun to kind of talk through some real life examples. So if you look on your screen, you should see three celebrities. So we have everything from movie stars to, world-renowned fighters. And one thing that they have in common outside of being famous is that they all have interesting financial lives that you can do some Googling and a little bit of research to learn more about. A common thread between these three folks is that they all were high income earners. So we're talking in the millions of dollars. And I think sometimes there's a conception that if you're earning a lot of dollars and you have a really high income, you can never run out of money. And I think what's a great example through these three is that's actually not true. So all three of these individuals had really high lifestyles that they were maintaining. They were really spending at these high income levels. And this is everything from owning private islands to really large exotic animals and all different kinds of things. And what that resulted in is some financial challenges. And so what they were doing is really spending beyond their means. This idea that their expenses were really starting to exceed their income versus if they had taken an approach where they were really focusing on prioritizing saving, kind of looking at the long term versus living for the now, they might be in a little bit of a different financial position today. Again, there's a number of different examples that you can look at for these kind of real life examples of why budgeting is important. But we'll just go ahead and dive right into how do you actually build a budget. So what you want to start with is looking at what are the dollars coming in. So this is your income sources. This is what your earned income is, whatever you're maybe earning from your salary or a side job. And then you also want to understand your expenses. There's a number of different ways that we can segregate expenses and think about them in different terms. But really, it's important to understand what are those dollars that are going out. And then once you look at the dollars coming in, less the dollars going out, then you can really start to understand, okay, are you spending within your means? So this is the idea of, are your expenses exceeding your income and therefore you're spending beyond your means, or are you spending less than what you're making and therefore you have a surplus? Ryan, could you talk a little bit about how savings fits into this piece of a budget?
Yeah, it didn't take long for us to caveat kind of the base plan. What we typically see as people get more control of their budget and further along in their careers, that last step, what remains saving, we typically see come more and more into spot number 2 before expenses. But we do need to understand expenses first, whether we're starting our career or changing jobs or life situations, so that we understand how much should be in our rainy day fund, perhaps. We don't want to come into a situation where there is a larger unexpected expense and we're having to dig into longer term savings, because then that takes away that very last part, the power of compounding. We need to establish ourselves up with some safety nets and procedures before we kind of dig into investing and long-term savings. So this is the first outlay, but typically it's very common and accepted that savings does start to trickle more into that spot number 2 as we get more comfortable with our budget.
Yeah, and I'll also add as we're going through this, Ryan and I's goal today is really to share some different perspectives on building a budget. I think what we'll also share is there isn't a one size fits all approach. There isn't, a prescriptive way to say this is the only way you should budget. We're going to talk about strategies that not only we do with our clients, but also that Ryan and I implement in our own budgets. And our hope is that as we're walking through this, that you all walk away with maybe some interesting takeaways that you can look at and implementing in your own budgeting journey. So with that, let's dig a little bit more into that top line, net income. I think a really important distinction is understanding your gross income versus your net income. And I think this is helpful because there's some ratios that are based around gross income. So it's good to know the number. But the reality is your net income is your take-home pay. So your gross income is the line that you typically see on your job offer, or it's the figure that you're negotiating for. And I think it's a lesson that we've all learned pretty early on, that your gross income is not actually what you're taking home. So what is the difference between those two? And the difference is really, you might have federal tax withholding on your gross income that translates to your net income. If you're in a state that has state income tax, you'll potentially also have income tax withholding from the state level. Also, if you have employer benefits, so if you think about health insurance that you're paying through your employer, or if you have some kind of life insurance or a long-term disability policy that's through your employer, those are also deductions that you'll see after the gross income. Also, if you have 401k contributions automatically coming out of your income or HSA contributions or other automated savings, that's going to be the difference. I think it's important to understand both figures so you have a sense of, okay, what is my top dollar versus what am I actually receiving on an ongoing basis? So then let's dig into the expense side of the budget. And again, as I shared earlier, there's a number of different ways that we can talk about expenses or approach expenses, but ultimately they fall into two categories. We have our wants and we have our needs. So our needs are what are considered our non-discretionary expenses. These are the things that we have to do. And this is going to look a little bit different for everyone, but kind of the broad categories stay consistent. So a major category would be housing costs. So if you're a renter, that's going to live in that category, as well as utilities or a mortgage payment. Groceries fit into this as well. And transportation costs are a component of that as well. So for me, I live in Seattle. Having a car is kind of a must for me versus Ryan lives in San Francisco, or if you're living in New York, you might be able to utilize public transportation a little bit more frequently, but it's still important to include that in your budget so you're actually allocating dollars for that. This also includes things like your insurance. So again, if you're a renter, you have your renter's insurance. You might have homeowner's insurance or auto umbrella coverage. This isn't extensive. There's more categories that might fit into this that we'll talk in a little bit more detail about. On the other side of our budget, we have kind of what I think about as almost the fun side. These are the things that we want to do. And this is also called our discretionary budget. So these are the things that we maybe don't have to do, but we'd like to do. And this can be pretty extensive and it's going to really vary by person. And we'll talk more about how your budget is really designed to reflect you and what is important to you. But this could include something like dining out. It's also concert season, so I know with the summer, that's a very top of mind part of our budgets. And the same is true with travel and vacation. So again, these are things that we want to be doing, that we want to be allocating dollars for in our budget. I've also listed subscription services on here. I think we all have probably more subscription services than we'd like to admit, or maybe even can keep track of sometimes. And this is really everything from your Netflix to your Disney Plus, or maybe if you've got Apple Music, Spotify. I know that I've got a number of different subscriptions, and I think it's helpful for me as I'm actually going through my budget to go and call those different pieces out so I'm making sure I'm allocating for them.
And then we have kind of two groups of spending rules. There's plenty of variations of these breakdowns, but they're kind of two core ones to kind of come back to, or ones that we transition to as we understand our budget. Starting with first is the 50-30-20, where we have 50% of our expenses on our needs. A lot of times things that are outside of our control are non-discretionary, as Julie discussed. 30% on wants, and then keep it in the back mind, the 20% on savings should try to be the goal. This is more commonly for people who have, maybe they're starting out in their career, or they've just gone through a big life transition. Maybe they have a new job that they need to recalibrate spending. They've moved to a larger, newer city. Oftentimes cost of living can be higher and we need to reevaluate. Or maybe you just moved in with a partner and you're going to start, sharing expenses in a way that you haven't before. So this is a good one that can be done individually or together. As we get more comfortable with that version of the budget and we understand what's coming in, what's coming out, we kind of weathered some unexpectedness, we can start moving more into the save 20%, spend 80%. This is where we have a deep understanding of our budget and shouldn't be something that we start off right away. I would say people with this approach often have multiple streams of automated savings income. They're not actively going into their accounts each month and applying funds towards various areas. They're automated, they're saving, and they typically have a really good understanding of how much cash they should hold on to be comfortable. Typically what we see is 3 to 6 months of savings, depending on your situation. If you are a single person, with no dependents, you can be in the 6 month. And as you have more people, or maybe you're part of a larger family or more, you can have more on the 6 month side of range. Typically what we see is you have that minimum threshold. If expenses do start to come beneath that threshold, maybe we need to refer back to up to the 50-30 approach and dig back in.
And I think regardless of whether you're taking more of a high level approach like Ryan described, or a little bit more of the granular approach that we've talked a little bit about and we'll continue talking about, there are a few rules of thumb that you can keep in mind whether you're building your first budget or if you're taking a look at your budget again today. And I'll also share, these are rules of thumb, and that means that they're general and sometimes they work for us and sometimes they're targets that we're working towards. So the first is the housing ratio. And this is the general rule that your rent and your mortgage should be about 25 to 30% of your gross income. As I say that, I also acknowledge that if you're living in a high cost of living area like Seattle, San Francisco, or New York, it can be really challenging to have your housing fit into that budget. So another way that we can think about this is a goal to work towards over time. We'll talk about how housing expenses can be a really important part of your budget that you want to keep an eye on over time because they can grow. But I think regardless of where you are, looking at this as your target. So if you're starting out and you say, gosh, my housing expenses really exceed that, maybe think about how over time you can either look at reducing housing expenses or growing income to bring that back into balance. The next rule of thumb is around savings, and this is really specifically focused on long-term retirement savings. And again, a good goal to keep in mind is the idea that you're saving 15 to 25% of your gross income towards these longer-term retirement goals. Now, this is another area that, depending on where you are in your financial journey, depending on your income and expenses, it might be challenging to meet that goal at certain times. So I think this is another area that's also really going to shift over time as your financial situation changes and grows. There's going to be periods of time where maybe you're just starting out and just even getting 5% saved is the great goal to meet, and that over time you're going to work towards that. And this is also the case that sometimes what we see with our clients is as their income grows and they're more mature in their career, they might have the flexibility to save above and beyond this too. So I think it's a good area to keep in mind, but recognize that it's going to shift as you have other goals that come into play. And the last area that I want to talk about is something that we get a lot of questions on, and it's asking, hey, are there rules of thumb for really that discretionary or that want side of my budget? And I think the reality is with this, there's not as many of these ratios that we can target to say, well, gosh, how much money should I be spending on clothing? Or how much should I be spending on going out to dinner with my friends? And this is where we really recommend taking a values-based approach to spending. So what this is, it's the idea that you're applying what's important to you, whether that's your values, your priorities, or your goals, and you're reflecting that within your dollars and how you're spending them. So I think this is an area where you're going to start to see budgets change based on who you are and what's important to you. So as an example, let's say that travel is something that's a really high priority to you and that brings you a lot of joy and fulfillment. That might mean that you're allocating more of that discretionary budget to travel than someone else. This can also apply for savings too. So if you say, gosh, one of my highest priorities is to buy a home, you might be allocating more of that discretionary, that want side of your budget into savings for a home. And I think another reason that we really like this values-based approach to spending is it helps to avoid some of that regret we might feel if we're overspending in a category and we say, gosh, I spent X amount of dollars on DoorDash last month. Does that really reflect my values? Is that really something I feel good about? And I think having a values-based approach can really allow you to be more integrated with your budget, have a really deeper level of connection with your spending, and really align it to say, this is how I want to reflect my time. And you can kind of think about this almost as we spend our time during the day. The reality is there's some amount of the day that we have to spend doing things that we need to do, whether that's working or cleaning the house, or for me, it's grocery shopping. Sometimes it's not my favorite activity. But the rest of the time I get to spend it doing things I like. And so I always feel better after a day if I've spent my fun time doing things that I really enjoy that really bring me a lot of fulfillment. And I think that's the same approach that you can take really when it comes to building your budget. So now that we've talked a lot about how to build the budget, how to think about it, let's get tactical in terms of what are the resources that are available to all of us to build our budget. And there's two schools of thought here that we want to talk about. One is utilizing softwares, and apps to help automate your budgeting process. There are so many great tools out there that offer automated expense tracking. They link directly to a credit card or a bank account, and all of your spending gets captured right there, and it's really easy and clear to see. A lot of these apps can also provide additional finance features like looking at your net worth or maybe long-term goal setting. So I think that can be a really helpful tool if you want to be really efficient with your budgeting. On the other side, we have spreadsheets, and I think sometimes this gets thought of as maybe like an old school approach to budgeting, but I think it can still be really powerful even in the digital era that we live in today. So this is where you have probably a more granular approach to budgeting, where you're really digging in and you have some kind of document or spreadsheet that you're typing in what are your goals or what is that budget, and then you track against your actual spending. Now, the reality is there are pros and cons to both of these approaches, and you want to find the best approach that works for you. And for some people, that's going to be a mixture of both, and it might shift over time. For me personally, I actually use both. So I love using an app that automatically tracks my expenses. It saves me a ton of time versus having to go through a credit card statement. But I still input that into a spreadsheet so I can actually type out and say, okay, I said I was going to spend X amount of dollars in this category, But the reality is I spent a little bit more or I didn't spend as much. How do I feel about that? And again, you can have this real connection with your budget, which comes back to this concept of let's align our dollars with what's important to us and our values. So with that being said, we have an example of a spreadsheet, and full transparency, this is actually the template that I use for making my budget. So you can tell it's quite granular and definitely fits into that type A approach that I have in my life. And I think that what I'll also say is this is a pretty granular approach to budgeting, and this is going to make sense for some people, but again, not for everyone. So on the left-hand side, we have a real detailed look at income. So at the top, we have all the dollars that are coming in. And this is everything from your salary to your bonus. And you'll also see that I called out a column for a side hustle or side income. So if you're walking dogs on the side to help pay for your cup of coffee, or maybe you do a bit of house sitting with friends and family, definitely make sure that you're tracking those dollars that are coming in so you have a good sense of all of the money that's coming into you and where that's going. Also, I've included a section if you want to dive into that more granular approach of what is your true net income, so you can document your federal and state tax withholding if that's important to you. Also tracking some of those employer deductions. I think this is helpful for you if that kind of granularity is meaningful. Also tracking out what are your automated savings, how are you allocating those dollars with every paycheck. On the right-hand side, we're starting to dig into that true granular expense approach, and you'll see that we're bucketing this both into the non-discretionary, so again, those are the needs in our life, versus discretionary or our wants. So under non-discretionary, a couple examples of categories that might fit into that is, again, those housing costs. So you have rent, mortgage, utility, Wi-Fi, parking is a big one. And again, if you have a car, insurance payments. And you'll also see that I've included a line item for a car payment or a student loan payment. If you have a recurring debt obligation, so some kind of debt that you're paying off, that might actually fit into that need category in your budget. Below that, we have our discretionary. So again, this is the wants. And you can start to see where the real customization comes into your budget. And this is not only to reflect your values, but I think it's also a great opportunity to actually reflect how you spend your dollars and how you think about it. So again, I'm cheating a little bit and showing you all my budget, but what you can see here as an example is I bucket dining out into two different categories. One, I think about what are the dollars that I'm spending getting lunch with my colleagues throughout the week versus maybe when I'm getting dinner at a nicer restaurant on the weekends with my friends. So that's an example where you can really customize this to show how you're thinking about those dollars. Another example is I have a special budget line item for books. I'm an avid reader, so it's important to me that I'm allocating dollars in my budget for that. And I think I'd love to hear, Ryan, as you think about your budget, what are other areas of customization that you see or that you think are important for people to look at when they're building that budget?
Yeah, I think it all comes back to values-based spending. When it comes to our budget, like nobody's saying what's good or bad, that's up to you. It's really just meant to give us insight and making sure that these expenses align with us. Whether that's, spending more on a gym membership than maybe person Y does, like that's totally acceptable and encouraged as long as we're being intentional and know how much is coming in or out. It's also great for understanding, as Julie mentioned, Uber Eats. We all love Uber Eats or DoorDash, but does that amount perhaps really align with how much I actually like it? So it's a sobering way to look at things. There's no wrong or right answer. It's just a way for us to look into and making sure that our spending aligns with us. And, we can make those trade-offs a little bit more easily when we're looking at the full picture.
And I think that's exactly right, Ryan. I mean, there is no right or wrong way. I think it's making sure that you're prioritizing the right areas for you. And with that, I think let's talk a little bit about what are the dangers of not prioritizing the right areas for you. And that's something that we call lifestyle creep. So lifestyle creep is really this concept or this idea that as your income is growing over time, so as you're working more, maybe you're getting larger bonuses, you're promoting at your job, as your income is growing, your expenses are growing with that without another adjustment somewhere to bolster up your savings. And I think this is, again, if we come back to those examples earlier with the celebrities, this is a challenge that a lot of these folks ran into as these big dollars are starting to come in. They're just spending at that level without taking a step to go back and say, okay, what are my long-term goals and how am I allocating for the future rather than just today? That's all true. And it isn't always a bad thing for your lifestyle to increase over time. So I think that's important, again, to think about maybe an example of when you were first starting out, maybe you were in college and you were shopping at one kind of grocery store versus once you got that first job and you started feeling a little more comfortable with your cash flow, you might be shopping at a little bit of a different grocery store. or buying clothing from different stores that you might like a little bit better. So I think from our perspective, it isn't always a bad thing. It's just important to keep an eye on this and keep this in check, again, with that real core concept of spending within your means throughout your lifetime, which really lays the groundwork for that long-term financial stability. Ryan, when you think about lifestyle creep, what are some strategies that you think make sense for people to keep an eye on this or help mitigate that?
Yeah. And again, just to highlight what Julie said, we are all for, quality of life. Lifestyle creep is the connotation that we are, spending in some areas without thinking about the financial picture as a whole. So, spend what is valuable to you, but, we need to be looking at all areas of our lives. But it's easy to let those places slip if we're not paying attention to them. Monitoring housing costs is mentioned here first because in most of our budgets, that's probably the biggest lever that we have. Some of it is uncontrollable depending on which city we live, and it can be high cost of living. But there's also a lot of, hidden costs. Just because we get a pay raise doesn't necessarily constitute that we should upgrade our living, because rental costs do increase, typically with inflation, 2.5, even if you're in the same spot, oftentimes maybe that just rose with your pay increase. Even if you have a home that you own and you're paying a mortgage, and that of course stays flat, homeowners insurance, especially with, people on the coast, we've seen that has not just crept up, but jumped up quite considerably. So there are costs that, some that we do control, but nonetheless should be monitored going forward. A way to really, mitigate that has, been the 401k in general and all the capabilities inside of there, particularly automatically increasing your contributions. Mine is set to increase 1% each year. So that way, money never even comes into the account. It is just set to increase those contributions until inevitably at some point maxing out. I would look into what's available through your plan. And if not, maybe go back through the other accounts, and such as your IRA or savings into taxable accounts. If you're saving $200 a year in savings, maybe make it $250 and just creep that up, year by year. It's all about, forming good habits. I wouldn't be deterred just because maybe a $25 a month increase or $50 a month increase doesn't feel like a lot. It's all about building habits over time, which is really what we're trying to get across today. And also proactively plan for bonuses. Bonuses are not a given. So if we start incorporating, big spending into our lives that we don't get last year, we see it all the time that maybe it does start to come out of that monthly budget and we're digging into cash reserves more than what we should be. What's really worked for me is having a prioritized tier list of things that I want to accomplish with my bonus. And if I don't get to everything, then I don't get to it. That could be, funding, certain IRA accounts for this year and next, having X amount of funds towards intermediate goals. And if there's anything left over, then maybe, I do something that aligns with my values, whether it's going to nicer dinners, buying, better concert tickets, this or that. But, being intentional and having a plan, doing something that works for you. There's no, one size fits all, but being intentional is the most important part. And yearly check-in on our budget review, especially as your income grows. Are we just kind of letting things slip towards, everyday spending that's, not so cognizant of? Reviewing that once a year is very important. And monitor and track cash balances. This is particularly important for the people who are evolving into the save 20, spend 80 approach. We really want to make sure that our cash accounts are not dipping below that minimum threshold, that 3 or 6 month amount of expenses. If they do, then maybe we need to refer back to a more detailed approach. And maybe developing a plan of better saving, more tactical automated savings, and sparsing up our expenses into more typical monthly or our chunkier one-time expenses, insurance, flights, weddings, which have become more and more common, and maybe that should become part of the more normal budget. But whatever works best for you, monitor that going forward, especially if we're doing the save early, spend everything else.
Great. So we've talked a lot about budgeting, and we think that we can't finish this conversation without really digging into savings a little bit more. So we're going to start by just talking about different kinds of goals and different timelines that you might have for dollars that you're saving, and then share some thoughts on where you might want to keep those dollars and how you might want to think about those dollars and their allocation. So I think this first bucket, this is really our short-term bucket. So you can think of this as expenses or goals that might be coming up in the next couple of weeks, couple of months, or even maybe the next year or two. So some examples of this might be your rainy day or your emergency fund. So that's something like 3 to 6 months of expenses like Ryan shared. Depending on your situation, you might have a little bit more than that. We have some folks that maybe look at 8 months plus set aside in that cash fund. It really depends. This is also the day-to-day cash flow. So what you're going to use to buy your groceries next week or to cover your car insurance next month. But this can also start to look into maybe some of those goals that are around savings. So maybe a large purchase. So an example could be you've got a really exciting vacation coming up 6 months from now, and you want to start planning ahead for that. Or another one that I know is common for a lot of us is having to buy a new car. So Ryan, when you think about some of these shorter term goals, what kind of accounts do you think make sense for folks?
Yeah, a checking account we all know of is used for our monthly, daily spend. And on top of that, most of the time it's paired with a savings account. Now, I use my savings account for larger expenses that I know are coming up eventually, but not necessarily. Maybe it is saving up for flights or a car registration comes in at a couple $100 a year. And I heard that when I was young, that a scary amount of people couldn't afford if their car broke down. So that is my mental accounting, $1,000 if my car ever breaks down. So a lot of these accounts are these larger expenses that we know are coming up eventually inside this time frame, but we don't have necessary control of when they actually happen. Such as Julie said, your car breaks down. Savings is meant for some of the more pain, the insurance, flights. And if we're thinking about perhaps a car purchase, maybe an engagement ring inside of 3 years, and we want to start putting money away, that'd be where we use our high yield savings account or brokerage account. You're saying brokerage account and all three of those items. A brokerage account is not just for options trading with Robinhood. It can be a very conservative investments. And we're thinking very low risk, high liquidity, high yields. 4% is a pretty common yield that we're seeing in money markets and high yield savings account these days.
Ryan, why do you think it's interesting to have a high yield savings account or utilize a money market fund where you're getting more interest on that?
It goes back to building good habits. Even if this amount doesn't feel like a lot to us, eventually if we get in the good habits, these accounts will grow as our income rises. If we add a partner, now we just doubled everything. So we want our money working as hard for us as possible. Optimizing throughout our entire financial career will pay dividends. It isn't always so satisfying on the front end. A lot of this is for our long-term approach. But optimizing, having our money work as hard as for us as possible is why we promote high yield savings accounts and money markets.
Yeah, I think it's a really good feeling, again, to your point, even if I'm only allocating a little bit of money here and there into that savings account, it feels good to get more interest on that. I know my dollars are working really hard for me. So I think it's also it's a good feeling to see that and say, okay, I know I'm optimizing around my picture here. Once we start to move past that short-term time horizon, so again, these things that are coming up soon, we start to live in this intermediate bucket. And so these are things that might be coming up over the next 3 to 10 years. And there's a whole range in the middle of that. So some examples you might think about are, again, a large purchase. So I already used the car example, but it could also be a milestone trip. So let's say you've got a celebratory birthday coming up and you want to make sure it's a really memorable trip. That might be the kind of expense that you're planning a few years ahead. If you're really focused on saving for a home purchase, this might be where you're kind of starting to say, okay, these are my dollars for that down payment. Or if you're already a homeowner and you've been looking at your roof and thinking, okay, 5 years from now, I think we're going to have to cover a new roof. This is also kind of where those dollars might be allocated. Ryan mentioned this earlier. He and I are both in the thick of wedding season with our friends. So I think that's a really top of mind area that I see my friends saving for. So this could be an event that you're saving for, like a wedding, or again, like a milestone birthday or some kind of celebration that you want to make sure that you're planning ahead for. I've also listed educational planning here, and you can see that this shows up both in the intermediate and the long term. I think in this context, I'm thinking really about, ourselves. So a lot of folks say, hey, at some point in time, I'd like to go back and get maybe a master's degree or further my education, whether that's through a master's degree or some kind of certificate. That could be a budget and a goal that you're budgeting for and starting to save for earlier rather than later. Ryan, when you think about these intermediate goals, what kind of accounts do you think someone might want to look at for those?
Yeah, a savings account, maybe definitely the more shorter term savings. But as we get into, the multi-year 5 to 10, we're going to start looking at a high yield savings account, want to get some real yield that will actually make a difference over the course of years and years. And even a brokerage account where now we'll finally start to maybe mix in, some stock allocation, or what we would prefer, mutual funds or ETFs, which is a basket of stocks that represent certain parts of the market. Because there is a big difference between saving for a car in 3 years and a home in 10. We would say, as we definitely approach needing to utilize these funds, we pare back as much as possible the stock exposure. If we're paying attention to the markets, we've seen things fall quite quickly, and they typically take a while to come back. So we don't want to be overexposed if we need collateral for a mortgage and the market falls precipitously. So high yield savings account, brokerage accounts, for money market accounts are still perfectly usable for this 3 to 10 year time frame.
Yeah, and what I'm really hearing from you, Ryan, is that depending on the timeline for that, you really want to have maybe a balanced allocation. So thinking about some portion of those dollars that are really focused on preservation, because we know this is money that we're going to need, but also looking at adding in some growth, especially if we have a little bit of a longer term time horizon that can kind of help bolster that savings goal over time.
Exactly.
On the long-term side, this is where we're starting to look really 10 years and out. So some examples of long-term savings goals. One that we talk a lot about is retirement. And I'll also acknowledge that when you're in your earlier half of your life, thinking about retirement can kind of feel like this is this long, far off goal that like, sure, someday eventually I'll retire. But the truth is that it can really come sooner than you think. And the power of savings earlier rather than later is something that really helps set you up for a strong retirement. Another example could be educational planning, and this might be educational planning in the context of kids if you have them, or maybe family members that you might want to help with their college savings as well. So for these longer term goals, Ryan, how do you think about the accounts and the investments that someone might want to look at?
Yeah, so for the account type, if we're talking about like our personal retirement, a pretty common one is a 401k, which we've heard of. If you're a government employee or nonprofit, you may have a 403b, same thing for all intents and purposes, or an IRA, individual retirement account, comes in the form of Roth or traditional, and a brokerage account. And thinking about our long-term investments is still a perfectly fine account to use for. This may be like overflow funds after we've maxed out 401ks, IRAs, and we still have some intermediate term goals accomplished. Now we can, it's a little bit of overflow for additional funds. And if we have a child and we do want to front those costs for college in almost 2 decades from the time of birth, a 529 plan is going to be our most effective way to save for that. It's basically like a Roth IRA, but for college, where funds grow in, depending on which state you're in, can be tax deductible, but they mostly grow tax-free and come out tax-free. For the allocation here, we should be pretty comfortable being aggressive. And when we say aggressive, this refers to the percentage of our funds that are invested towards stocks, or again, ETFs and mutual funds would be the preferred way. And what we've seen in terms of volatility doesn't exactly affect us as much as if we were preparing to utilize these funds for a mortgage or a down payment. So we are okay with volatility as savers. Money is going into this volatility. With drops in the market aren't necessarily a bad thing. We're just buying in at lower prices. We shouldn't be losing sleep at night with some of the volatility, but if we are, we do say that it's okay to kind of pare back some of that exposure if we're thinking about getting out of the market. Find something that's comfortable for you, but this should be an allocation that you sleep well at night, but also captures growth for long-term gains towards retirement.
Yeah, and I think that makes a lot of sense, Ryan, because when I think about like how I would feel about money that I don't need to touch for another 15, 20 years, I certainly feel a lot differently about that than money that I need for a car purchase 2 years from now. So I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yep. And this graph is just, really important about starting early. It's $500 a month growing at 7%. It's really highlights the benefit of compound interest and, starting early instead of waiting until, maybe I'll feel better perhaps when I'm 30 and I have X amount. Now that feels like a sufficient amount. If that's really just what the math and investments has told us over and over again, is not the best way to go for it. Save your relative amount of income. As your income grows, so will your expenses. We can, look at years, even, 25 to 30. That's a 50% increase just starting 5 years earlier, but only $30,000 more invested if we take, $6,000 a year for those 5 years. So it's really important, starting early, do what you can, build good habits, and let compound interest catch up way down the line. You won't see it right away, but it's working, part of the plan. So start early, do what you can, be consistent. And now, yeah, the accounts for retirement, kind of the big three here: Roth IRA, traditional IRA, and a 401k. Your Roth IRA and traditional, these funds come out of your bank account. Roth IRA is after tax and grows tax-free. A traditional IRA still comes from your bank account, but depending on whether you have access to a plan, you can deduct these at the end of the year. Speak to a professional, make sure that we're categorizing these right. The 401k has become, increasingly more flexible. We can have pre-tax, after-tax, or Roth contributions. After tax is slightly different than Roth. It's after we've likely already maxed out our Roth IRA and we're taking advantage of growth 401k. And it comes in as after-tax dollars, pay tax on them, but the growth inside of it is tax deferred. So amounts coming out of there will be prorated tax-wise when we ultimately use them. And also, look at what employer contributions are. Again, another caveat where we say that you should, save and understand expenses, but I would really, as much as we can possible, take advantage of the employer match. Even if it's 3%, that's still free money that we should be taking advantage of, and usually a pretty good first bar to achieve as an early saver. Withdrawals for these accounts will be tax-free as a Roth IRA. That's a huge benefit. Traditional IRAs taxed as income. If you're a W-2 employee, it's taxed as ordinary income, just the same. And then depending on what the contributions were inside the 401k, it'll be either tax-free or taxable. The contribution limits for IRAs is $7,000 a year. As we review our budget each year and we think maybe I can increase contributions, I would check to see what the IRA contribution limits are. They have crept up over previous years, and we continue them to do so at, loosely in line with inflation. Same with 401ks. They have increased their limits over the last couple of years, and $23,500 pre-tax or Roth are the current amounts. For Roth, pitfall, make sure that if you're not too high of an earner, you're contributing directly into Roth. You can do Roth conversions. You'll see that there's a phase out limit that essentially says, just rough math, if maybe you make 160,000, you can only do 3,000 into a Roth, and you got to do the next 4 into a traditional IRA. That'll depend on what your income is towards the end of the year. And no income limits for traditional IRAs or 401ks. And there are some exceptions to when we can finally access these funds, but largely it's 59.5. For IRAs, there could be $10,000 for a home purchase, some education needs, some hardship medical needs, and there's the rule of 55 for 401k, which won't affect us for some time. Required minimum distributions are not applicable for Roth IRAs, as we already paid our taxes on them. Government will not receive any taxes. They let us do that as we wish. But for traditional IRAs and 401ks, where we still do need to pay taxes, it is mandated that for people who are 73 right now, they'll need to take it out, but that number is getting pushed back for younger people. So right now the range is between 73 to 75, depending on how old you are. But these funds will need to come out. It's not the entire account. There is a formula for it. It's a relatively small amount. It doesn't need to get spent per se. It can go to another account, but taxes do need to be paid as we get older.
I really appreciate that overview of the retirement accounts, Ryan, because I think we talk so much about the importance of this long-term savings, but actually understanding where do those dollars go is so helpful. One thing that really stuck out to me as you were talking through the retirement accounts is I heard a lot of these interesting tax advantages, which definitely make retirement accounts really interesting. But the other thing I heard and saw is that there's limits on the dollars that you can put in, and there's some constraints around taking those dollars out. So this is really where we see a taxable account or a brokerage account be a really powerful tool on your balance sheet. So taxable accounts and brokerage accounts, like Ryan shared earlier, these are investment accounts that can hold anything from mutual funds or exchange traded funds or ETFs, which offer really diversified approaches to investing, to buying a money market fund for kind of that intermediate savings goal. So we see taxable accounts as really your flexibility account. You can, as Ryan shared really well, you can add more dollars into this after you've maxed out a 401k or an IRA. So these are really helpful tools for that flexibility when it comes to long-term savings. An important piece to keep in mind with taxable accounts or brokerage accounts is that as those dollars are growing in those accounts, you may owe taxes on that growth versus a retirement account like Ryan shared. is either tax deferred or even tax free. So it's just important to keep this in mind, especially when you're thinking about what are these dollars for and how are you allocating them. So I've shared a few notes on the screen here that some of the income that's produced from these accounts, like the dividends or the interest that's produced from those investments, that might be taxed at the ordinary income rate. So these are those higher income rates that we typically pay our earned income taxes on. Also, if you have an investment and you're selling it within less than a year and it's applicable to the short term, it's a short-term capital gain, that's going to be taxed at that higher rate. Versus long-term capital gains. So if we're holding an investment for over 1 year, when we go to sell it, we're at the more favorable capital gains tax rates, which are listed below. So all of this comes down to really, again, focusing on what are the goals for the dollars in that brokerage account and being really intentional with the investments that you're selecting for that account and planning ahead for that. So let's say that you set your home down payment in a brokerage account, and then a few years from now, you're saying, okay, it's time to liquidate the funds and go buy the house. Keep in mind that you might owe taxes when you go to do that actual liquidation. So with all of that, we want to leave time for Q&A, but just want to walk away with a few key takeaways for you all on next steps. So starting is just the idea that budgeting is really personalized. And again, as we've said multiple times, there isn't a one size fits all approach to this. What's most important is that you find the right budgeting tools and the right cadence for you to review that budget that makes sense for you. Again, this core idea of spending less than what you make. So just always keeping an eye on what are the dollars coming in relative to what's going out. With that is also prioritizing your savings goals and being really clear on what those goals are and what are the strategies that are going to help you meet them, both in the short term and in the long term. The other reality is, as we've talked about, budgeting, like finances, and actually most things in our life, there's always trade-offs. So we can't always have our cake and eat it too. So it's just being really aware and intentional with every dollar that you're spending on X might mean you're spending less on Y, and making sure that you're okay with that and being fluid in that. Your budget is going to change, and what's important to you today might be a little different in a few years. So with that, here are your next steps. The first is to define your budgeting goals. So if this is your first time building a budget, or maybe you've been a long-time budgeter and you're saying, hey, it's time for me to kind of refresh what I'm really trying to work on here, start with that. What are you really working towards? Then actually go and either build your budget for the first time, maybe using one of the tools we talked about, or give it a refresh, especially if it's been a few years since you last updated your categories. Also, as we've talked a lot about, the power of savings, starting early and starting often, utilize an automated savings plan to help set it up so you don't have to look at it. Ryan said this really well. If you're saving money right off the top, you never even get used to spending that. So it's always a lot easier to pull back on savings later on if you need to than to have to pull back on spending and push into savings. Finally, set it and do not forget it. As we've shared multiple times, a core piece of having a budget and a budgeting plan over time is that you're reviewing this on an ongoing basis. Budgeting, even if you're the most skilled budgeter, it's not set it and forget it. Life happens and your goals are going to change over time. So it's really important that you allow your budget and your cash flow strategies to grow and evolve with you. So with all of that, we do want to leave some time for Q&A. And I think, Emily, maybe you can help us with moderating that.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. I think that's really great foundation. And I think Ryan said, in the way I think about budgeting really focuses on paying myself first, right? And savings is how can I think about what I want in the future and paying that into my account. I am someone who cannot see it come into my account. I don't want to know that the money is there. And so I think a lot of the tips you gave on automating the process is incredibly important. The more you can automate and the more you can make this as just part of your daily life, the easier it becomes. I think I'm different than you, Julie, in the fact that I don't want to see every line item. I don't want to revisit it. I don't want this to be part of my daily life. And so how can I make it so that I don't have to think about it? And to Ryan's point, using those percentages and just having it say 10% goes to this account automatically every month, sets you really up for success in the future. And then as your salary increases, that percentage continues to go up because it's not a dollar value. So I love the little tips and tricks you gave that you can just start incorporating into your life, even if you don't leave here and say, I want to build a massive budget and start tracking all this, although it is a really good foundational step. And sometimes just doing it one time helps. But there's lots of little things that we can implement. So I really appreciate all the kind of insight that you both gave. we do have a lot of questions coming in, so I definitely want to spend time getting to them. One of the questions that was asked was around the savings of the 15 to 25% of gross income. And they asked if that includes the 401k contribution. So do you think of the 401k as part of that long-term savings, or do you kind of bucket out retirement separate?
Yeah, I would say you definitely do want to include your employer contribution into that. I think Ryan said this really well earlier. That's a benefit, and actually part of your compensation is what your employer is helping contribute to your 401k. So absolutely taking advantage of that and thinking about that as part of that goal. I think the reality is the more you can save towards retirement, the more flexibility you're going to have. So don't think of that 15 to 25% as the cap either. If you're feeling like you want to save above and beyond that, keep doing it. It's providing more flexibility for you later in life.
Yeah.
Um,
And I think there has been some talk about saving towards, the more short-term items, maybe a car where that is saving and we don't want that to affect our monthly budget. So that's how we mentally think about and set systems up to prepare for that. But, a car perhaps is a depreciating asset, whereas 401k investments, that's really the true 20-25% that we're talking about is growth investments, not depreciating assets for, vacations or cars, things of that nature.
We had a question come in about brokerage accounts. Are there any recommendations for a brokerage account?
Yeah, so there's a lot of great institutions that offer brokerage accounts. Schwab and Fidelity are great, easy places where you can access that. I think there's a number of different places where you open the brokerage account, and I think what's important to keep in mind that it may not be as important as where the account is versus how much you're putting into the account and the kinds of investments that live in the account.
Yeah, a lot of the custodians are very highly regulated. Chances are one of the big ones that you've heard of are perfectly acceptable.
We had a question come in around an example of, so we showed on the compounding interest slide that we use 7% as the return number. And they said, what is the foundation for using this number? So happy to take it since I know we worked on this slide, but the 7% return assumption is just really a commonly used benchmark based on historical long-term averages of a diversified portfolio. So typically weighted towards equities, while actual returns, we have to remember, vary year to year. But what we're looking at is over multiple decades, a balanced portfolio. So typically think, let's say 60% stocks, 40% bonds, has often averaged around the 6 to 8% mark annually. So really we use that 7% as a reasonable illustrative estimate to show the power of compounding over time, understanding that actual performance will definitely depend on market conditions, asset allocation, individual risk tolerance. There's a lot that goes into it, but we just like to show that as an illustration, being understanding that it's typically a diversified portfolio. On that, we did get a question around what is a diversified portfolio, and I know this is going a little bit more into investments, but what does a diversified investment strategy mean? What should my account look like if I'm thinking about a diversified strategy?
Yeah, I think this is a great area where I know I don't want to steal the thunder of our future topics, but I think just some high level components to be thinking about are not, I think a great way to describe this is, not wanting to have all your eggs in one basket. So a diversified strategy means having investments in different areas of the investment market. So that could look like you're investing in US companies as well as international companies. That could also mean having some exposure potentially to real estate investments, or even looking at, depending on your situation, again, maybe you're allocating towards fixed income or bonds, which have more stability. And even within that, there's diversification we can explore. So I think how I really think about this, and I think Ryan would agree, is just wanting to be mindful of having exposure to different kinds of investments. So as markets move around and do different things throughout a year or throughout a season, you have exposure to different areas that are performing.
Yeah.
Another question we got was when you talked about short-term and intermediate term building out that portion of your budget, would US Treasury notes, T-bills, or municipals also work when it comes to investing that part of your portfolio to help reduce taxes?
So I'm not sure in terms of reducing taxes. Municipal bonds likely wouldn't result in taxes. So those could be good, but it wouldn't reduce taxes. They are a tax efficient way to invest, depending on your state. They may not make sense depending if you're maybe a lower income person. We would want to get more yield and then just get taxed on that. That depends on the investor.
Yeah,
But yeah,
I think that's the big thing, right, Ryan, is really just
yeah,
talking to that planner. I think it's
hmm
understanding what your total portfolio looks like. Yes, right. Treasuries are exempt from state taxes and munis from both, but the yields can move around a bit. And so it's best to really work with a planner who can help identify the best fit for a given client situation based on income brackets, to your point, especially
yeah,
with where muni yields are right now. It's really dependent on what tax bracket you are in. Tips are a good option for protecting against surprise inflation. So it is a decent tool if you're trying to hedge against inflationary impacts of tariffs. And we can definitely talk more about that in the investment session. But I think
yeah.
to this point, it really is dependent on your personal situation. So it is hard to kind of talk to without knowing who that client is.
And I would say that these were typically serve as more of the intermediate term goals, like anything with a maturity, maybe we don't have inside like the, couple months inside of a year. So this would be more of an intermediate play.
We had another question come in asking, can you explain the term free cash flow? Which I think is a great question. Do you guys want to take that?
Ryan, do you want to take that one? Or I can take it.
I mean, when I think of free cash flow, I
Yeah.
think of, companies and they generate extra. When it comes to personal budgeting, I guess this would be, what's left over. And maybe this is
Yeah.
where we start, either applying values-based spending or it's a great opportunity to ratchet up investments.
Yeah.
So this is, after needs, maybe this is the wants. I think typically I think of companies, but Julie, I guess what do you think?
Yeah, I think I kind of think about this in the context of a personal budget as really your surplus or your shortfall. So again, that's that kind of the basic math of it, of the income less expenses, what is at the end? If you have a surplus, so there's a positive sign there, that's kind of these free cash flows. So I think that's where it comes to, okay, what are your goals? And I think Ryan said this so well when talking about bonuses and prioritization of goals. So let's say that you've met all of your different savings goals within your budget and you've still got some left over. This is where you can step into, I kind of think about this as the ideating side of it. What is important to you? Do you want to have more flexibility in a certain area? Do you want to prioritize more for a certain savings goal? Or maybe there's some kind of special purchase that you've been really excited for. So I think that's where that surplus or shortfall really comes into play, and just keeping an eye on that to really think about what is important to you and where do you want to allocate that. And if you're finding that on an ongoing basis, you're having a lot of this surplus, maybe think about increasing some of the savings targets within your budget so you're really getting that closer to zero each month.
What about when it comes to debt and deciding between paying off debt versus 401k up to the employer match? What would
Yeah,
you
I think it's a
do?
really great question, excuse me. And I think it's so dependent on your individual situation too, and really what that debt is. I think, on my Instagram, I talk a little bit about the idea of good debt versus bad debt, and like where is that in the middle? And, as we shared earlier, some things just depend. So it really depends on your individual situation. What is that debt for? Is this something like a student loan or a mortgage? Or is this something like a credit card debt or some other kind of consumer debt? And then I think also looking at what are the interest rates. So if that debt is costing you 20%, so that might be a credit card debt, gosh, prioritizing paying that down, that's costing you a lot of money. But I think that's also, this isn't a black and white situation. There's always nuance, right? And so you want to think really individually about your situation and partner. I think this is a great time to partner with an advisor and say, hey, can you help me think about how to prioritize debt strategies versus savings, and what is the balance that makes sense for me and again like your individual goals.
What about how often it makes sense to review one's budget? Is this something that's better to have an advisor to review it with, or can
Yeah.
individuals just do this on their own on an ongoing basis?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is another one, not for the cop out of it depends, but it does, right? So I think, for me, when I started building my first budget and I was early on, and I was kind of coming right out of college, I was really watching every single dollar and I was really wanting to look at this pretty often. And so I think in some phases of your life, you might be looking at this pretty granularly. So a lot of times what we see both with ourselves and I think with our clients is if we're in a period of time of transition and there's things that are shifting, maybe you've moved, maybe you got a new job, that might be a really important time to come back to that budget and really understand where are my dollars going? How do I feel about this? So that might be a point in time where you're looking at this more granularly. If you're really setting up all of your automated savings, like Ryan, you talked about, I think that might be a point in time where you can say, okay, maybe I'm looking at this less often. Maybe that's on a monthly or a quarterly basis. And I think when it comes to working with an advisor on it, it's also, again, really going to depend on your financial situation and what your goals are and what you and that advisor are prioritizing in the work that you do together.
Yeah. And I personally, so one of the things that I do for my budget, and I just, to my point earlier, I don't love looking at an ongoing basis, but I do have it in the back of my mind, right? So the
Yeah.
first time that I built that budget, I looked at the last 3 months of credit card expenses that felt like they really averaged out what my overall expenses were. And
Yeah.
I looked at that and then on a monthly basis. In the back of my mind, I then knew I could spend X amount when I would grocery shop. I could spend X amount on these discretionary expenses. I just kind of had those numbers in the back of my mind. So as I was spending throughout the month, it wasn't limiting myself, but I at least knew what my parameters were and what I should be
Yeah.
spending and, if I've gone over it. And then you could just open up your credit card statement or debit card statement and just kind of look at what are you spending? Where does it kind of see? You can always do rough estimates. So it doesn't always have to be this formal process where you sit down and you're updating a spreadsheet. It really could be as simple as just saying, I feel like I spent X amount on groceries this month. I probably should be, a little bit tighter coming into the end of the month or kind of stop spending in other areas. Once you get that budget down over a couple of months, you really start to get the sense of what's working and what isn't. It can also help evolve the budget over time. To Julie's point, things will change. So it's really important that you're looking at it when it feels right to you. It's not a formal process. And it shouldn't have to feel like it's restricting you. It should feel like it's just being helpful in getting you to your end goals.
I know we're bumping up against time, but
Yeah.
one little thought that I just want to share on that, and this is something that again that I do with my friends, and I also talk about it with my clients, and it's the idea of making this a fun process too. So I think Ryan said this earlier. Budgets don't have to be constraining. They don't have to be a scary word that we don't talk about or that we're afraid to talk about. It can be a really great, empowering experience and make it fun. For me, when I sit down with my budget, I go to my favorite coffee shop, I get my coffee, and I sit down and I look at it, and it doesn't feel stressful versus if I, locked myself in my office and turned all the lights off and, lit a candle. I mean, you can make this a fun process for yourself too, that I think can make it even enjoyable potentially, from my perspective.
Agreed. Thanks, Julie. And one thing, can everyone get your budgeting tool or will you be sending that
Yes.
around after the call?
Yeah, we're happy to send that out. And again, I will caveat that's definitely a more granular approach. And I think Emily and Ryan have really shared this well that, not everyone wants to have that granular of approach, and that's totally fine. Again, there's some really great tools out there that I think can help you with an automated approach to your budgeting, as well.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
the
thank you both.
budgeting apps are in the slides, Monarch, Copilot, Rocket Money for the more type B people.
Yeah.
Yes, that is a very good point. And AI tools can be incredibly helpful as well when building your budget. So obviously being sensitive in putting in proprietary, any like personal data and information. But if it doesn't include any of that, it can be really helpful in making this process streamlined and quick. So definitely look into that after. But I know we are at the top of the hour. And so I just want to thank you all again for joining us today. We'll be following up with the email after. It'll include the recording from today's session, the slides, as well as the budgeting tool. And then you can also register for our upcoming sessions in the Financial Foundation series. If you're a client and want to go deeper on any of today's topics, please don't hesitate to reach out to your advisor. They're always happy to go in depth and talk more about this. If you're not yet working with Wealthspire and would like to connect, the follow-up email will include a link to schedule a call or to reach out directly to our team. Thank you again. We really look forward to seeing you at our next session on July 29th. Thanks, everyone.